This is going to be a short introduction to chapter 4 in the second part. This is about solving finite games. And essentially it's about so-called best responses to a strategy that you think your player is going to use. But first let's assume that player number 1 actually knows exactly what strategy player number 2 is going to use. Let's call this strategy Q. What should player number 1 do? Well, there are basically two things. Player number 1 can try to pick the best row, and here he's picking row number I. In this sum, the index I is fixed. And he can try to choose the best row in order to maximize the outcome of the game. Or he could try to pick the best mixed strategy. So in the lower equation he's trying to pick the best possible mixed strategy. And it's a strange fact that both approaches will give player number 1 the same amount on average, picking a single row or picking a mixed strategy. Now, how does player number 1 use this? Well, if he doesn't know exactly what player number 2 will do, he can try to guess what the player is going to do. And by the previous lemma, he can do well just by trying to pick a row number I that maximizes his return, or gives him the best response. Now, this leads to the so-called upper and lower values of a game, which I'll briefly mention here. So let's change the rules of the game a bit and assume that player number 2 is in the bad position that this player must actually announce his strategy. Notice that this is slightly different from what we had before. Before, player number 1 learned what player number 2 was going to do, and maybe player number 2 doesn't actually know that player number 1 knows. So here everyone knows how the rules have been changed, and player number 2 must announce his or her strategy. So player number 1 will use what we learned a moment ago and choose a best response, either by choosing a row or a mixed strategy. Now, number 2 knows this, so he or she will announce in the beginning a strategy such that when one picks a best response against this, he's going to get as little as possible. And this is a so-called minimax strategy because it minimizes the maximum loss for player number 2. And you can flip the situation around now and assume the rules have been changed so that player number 1 must announce his strategy, and you get a similar definition of a minimax strategy for player number 1. And it's a fact that these minimax strategies, they always exist in finite games. We'll discuss that better in class. That's it for today.